What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco, where we have a few bored-rich businessmen who want to control the city to benefit their own egos and greed. It's an age-old tale. The Phoenix Project is a new organization that is, among other things, tracking some of these bored-rich people. And so we're going to discuss 5 of these wealthy egomaniacs today with Julie Pitta and Jeremy Mack. Go to patreon.com/San Francisco to support the podcast. You can also find our past episodes there, including the one with Julie and also some episodes where me and Soleil Ho talk about Michael Schellenberger and me and Emily Mills speak on Garry Tan, a couple of the other local egomaniacs who want to run things around here. Thank you to C. Dundas, MT, Ariane, Shaban, Math Class Warfare, and Tori and Blue, who are at the live podcast taping we just did. You all are helping to keep this podcast going. Here is the conversation with Jeremy and Julie. So Jeremy Mack is here and Julie Pitta is back to talk about the Phoenix Papers, the second drop. Very excited to have you both here. I figured that today we would kind of walk through what you all found out about 4 billionaires, one wannabe billionaire, and also would love to introduce some people to just, people that might not know what you all do, to the idea behind the Phoenix Project. To start, if people haven't listened to the episode that we did with Julie back in January, you all should go back and listen to that. We'll link to it in the show notes. But first off, could both of you let us know how you got involved with the Phoenix Project? Why was this something that you felt like was important for more people to know?
I'll go ahead and get started. I hadn't been politically active. I was busy raising my daughter and I was a freelance writer and editor. But I noticed that there was a lot of money pouring into an election in my neighborhood, which is the Richmond district, a very quiet, family-oriented neighborhood. And yet in one supervisorial campaign, more than $1 million was poured into it. And having started out as a journalist, I started digging into it and I realized that money was coming from special interests, particularly the real estate industry. At that point, tech wasn't all that involved. That happened a bit later. So I started looking around for people who were seeing the same thing as I was and who were equally alarmed. And at some point, I was connected with Jeremy, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, Jeremy, him, the executive director of the Phoenix Project. And I was finishing up a master's degree at USF, doing a degree in urban and public affairs, into the YIMBY movement, in part because of the elections in 2022, and looking behind, who are the folks behind the recall campaigns and who are the folks behind looking into Prop D and Prop E and what's going on between these two different affordable housing measures. And just started to become increasingly on alert from the amount of money that was being poured into San Francisco elections and the difference between the talking points versus the folks behind the scenes, and the impacts versus the way that they were talking about it outwardly. And so it's the neoliberal housing policy generally. So that was kind of the beginning. And then graduating, I was looking to just get more deeply involved. And I was close with a mutually colleague of ours, Kelly Groth, who's a D1 person, who put me in touch with Julie and was like, hey, Julie's looking to start an organization that's hitting specifically on big money in politics in San Francisco, looking at the elections, and let's get you guys in conversation. So that was kind of the kickoff.
Yeah, what you mentioned there about money coming from outside the city, I always think it's so interesting to be in a place where people outside of San Francisco have this conception of what I guess San Francisco represents. That is maybe progressive space, even in the context of progressive states. it's always interesting to think about how much time people in other places are thinking about what's happening here in the city. Either of you would be down to talk about like the influence that money coming from outside San Francisco can have on our politics here?
Well, in some ways, a lot of the money that we're seeing being used in San Francisco politics is outside money. This is global wealth. This is tech industry wealth. There are a couple of people who are local real estate barons, but quite honestly, one of the real estate guys, John Kilroy, who we profile in this volume of the Phoenix Papers, he invests all up and down California. He invests in Texas. So, he has a fairly broad portfolio. San Francisco is only one municipality in which he invests. The same is true of William Oberndorf, our other real estate mogul. His investments go beyond San Francisco. And the tech people, their money is made in global wealth markets. It's not locally made. These aren't people like Levi Strauss who made money selling jeans to miners, in the gold country.
Yeah, we're talking about money made in, stretches, corners of the earth, and people that definitely are not paying into providing people in San Francisco with things like healthcare. They're not the big money behind our library system. But I guess let's go back a bit and talk more about the Phoenix Project and how it came to be.
Well, I started writing about what I was seeing in a very hyper-local paper. And I think that's how I attracted the attention of Kelly, who is our mutual friend. And, I think even Jeremy was aware of some of my work. So that was the impetus. And when we were defining the project, we had a very clear multi-step plan. The first paper was very focused on just showing folks, and when I say folks, I mean San Francisco voters, the phenomenon of this money pouring into races. Our second volume, which we just released, is showing the 5 most active donors and what their intentions are by taking a look at their past donations, not only locally, but statewide and nationally. The third phase, our next paper will focus on their specific local agenda. And finally, we will focus on the candidates who are benefiting from this billionaire money. This is a very, very important election year. And so we're trying to educate voters on a very, very disturbing phenomenon going on in San Francisco elections.
Yeah, just the other like logistical points. It was very easy to recruit board members for this organization and advisory board members because as soon as we started talking about Grow SF, Together SF, Neighbors for a Better San Francisco, and this like larger dark money network that was influencing and bringing on a right-wing politic into the city, everyone's like, yeah, great, sign me up. Like people have been watching what's going on. They've been over the last 5 years being like, if you're at all plugged into politics, and even if you're not really particularly, like seeing these different groups popping up and being like, this doesn't land right, this feels weird, I've never seen these groups before, like, and for people who were tuned into redistricting and like the post effects from that, it's like these groups have really come on the scene in this like pretty like blatant and well-financed way, well-organized way, and have really pushed the tide in a conservative direction coming off of like big progressive wins in 2020 and 2021. So it's really a reactionary movement. And so like starting to, talking to other folks who have been following it, they're like, oh, great. Like, how do I help? Like, how do I support? Like, can I volunteer? Can I where can you see me be plugged in? So it's been easy to build a coalition or collection of different people to help support the work. And this work wouldn't be possible without all the hard work from our board members like Julie, but also like Annabelle Ibanez and Hope Williams and Keen Chukwunetta, who are on our board, and then folks on our advisory board, Ben Griff, Tom Amiano, Lincoln Mitchell, Kelly Groth, Kyle Smealy, like folks that are all kind of plugged in different ways to help make this work possible. So, I think we kind of take a little bit of like the head of the org in terms of like we do a lot of the talking externally, generally with groups and like figurehead in some ways, but we've got a deep network of people who are committed to helping see the success of this group.
Adding to that, this is an easy sell for even those who may not be all that political. Longtime San Franciscans who've been working and volunteering in their communities do not like the idea of people buying elections, wealthy people buying elections. I mean, essentially wealthy people trying to mute their voices in the electoral process.
Totally agree. Yeah, like even if you aren't someone who is interested in voting in local elections, and in the past your eyes have glazed over when you think about who am I going to vote for mayor. I mean, the amount of money that we see through tools like the Phoenix Papers, the amount of money that a few like select very wealthy people are spending, I think should be sus to anyone who is living in the Bay Area, especially when they're coming out with so much of this, like the mailers that you see from Grow SF or Neighbors for a Better SF and some of these other groups that you all have been tracking. It is so vague. And in many cases, it's like, how did my name get on these mailing lists is what I've heard other people, question. And it's a little bit nefarious the way that, they're presenting themselves as these community-minded groups that are only interested in the best interests of everyone in San Francisco. But if you follow the money, they're linked back to a few people that have very specific desires for what they want to see in San Francisco. Maybe now's a good time to talk about the 5 people that you all look at, which, as you mentioned, these are like the top 5 spenders on local elections of late. We have Michael Moritz, William Oberndorf, Chris Larsen, John Kilroy Jr., and Garry Tan. A couple of these names will be familiar to people who have listened to this podcast. Could you give us like a little bit on each of these people, starting with Michael Moritz?
Michael Moritz was a tech journalist. He's actually Welsh. That's what brought him to the Bay Area. He was a reporter for Time magazine. And then he became, through some personal connections, a venture capitalist. He was known as a kingmaker in Silicon Valley, and his firm invested in some of the top names you can imagine. Google. He helped Elon Musk buy Twitter, Instacart, one of the more recent entries. He is the man behind Together SF, which has been in the news of late. Essentially, he's a classic wealthy guy who wants to play in politics. He's really all about maximizing his wealth. And so he gets most excited about lowering taxes and lowering any barriers for the business class.
Yeah, I mean, something that seems to connect them all is like selfishness, greed, desire to grow their wealth that's already beyond like what most of us could ever imagine. So yeah, so next up, that was Moritz. We have William Oberndorf.
William Oberndorf is a real estate investor. He does not live in town. He lives out in Mill Valley. What's very interesting is you're right. Most of this is about maximizing their wealth or even adding to their wealth. But they all within that framework have particular pet projects. William Oberndorf is a big proponent of the privatization of public schools. He's been a leader in the charter schools movement. He was behind the recall of the school board. What better way to argue for privatization of public schools than saying that its governing board is incompetent? And that was the messaging there. He was the leading funder of the recall against our former district attorney, Chesa Boudin, and that seems to have just been over a personal tiff. He was willing to fund Chesa's first run for office, but Boudin was unwilling to remove San Francisco's status as a sanctuary city, and after that, Oberndorf became his enemy.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a problem. You can take one issue that is maybe a pet issue of the people that are funding all of these local issues, local campaigns, piss them off, and then you might have a totally different billionaire on your hands. Let's also talk about the Ripple, which is like a crypto coin, Chris Larsen, who launched this coin called Ripple and is now a billionaire as a result of it.
Yeah, Chris Larsen, what's interesting about all these folks is Chris Larsen himself does not have a PAC. He's given money to many of the other billionaire-backed PACs. They all seem to give money to each other. Moritz has given money to Grow SF. He's given money to Neighbors for a Better San Francisco. Larsen has been equally generous to the PACs. His major thing has been supporting the mayor to the degree that he actually set up a defense fund for her when some of the corruption allegations were getting close to her office. I believe that the reason they are so close is they share an interest in so-called law and order issues. Larsen is obsessed with law and order issues. He was a top funder for the law and order initiatives on the March ballot. He is particularly interested in high-tech surveillance. That's a real pet project of his. He has given high-tech surveillance cameras to a number of community groups in San Francisco to do with what they will, which I find to be very disturbing. So that's his interest.
Yeah. So yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, the community groups, does this include the sort of funding of effectively like extensions of the police? In the Tenderloin, we do have Urban Alchemy, this nonprofit with connections to the mayor via her ex, Mohammed Nuru, who ran the Department of Public Works and is now in prison as a result of corruption charges and bribery charges. So what kinds of things are they doing with this additional funding, given that the SFPD is pretty well funded on its own?
Well, that is a great mystery as we keep giving more and more money to the police, and we see very few results. There was a study that came out, I think, in the last year or two, which talked about how little San Franciscans get for their funding of the police. The results are terrible. The amount of money is extraordinary. We have one of the best funded police departments in the country. We have more police per capita than any city in California, even
Right.
Los Angeles. And yet response times for calls to the SFPD are abysmal.
Right. So yeah, I mean, they're not even doing the things that we are paying them to do, but yet it does seem like the answer when you ask that question is always like, well, they just need a little bit more money. They're like we're not funding them to allow them to do the things that they need to do. Basically just giving the police more leeway around.
Yeah, basically it's loosening the police commission's oversight. So we have a department that is underperforming. We keep giving them more money and we're loosening oversight of said department. What about that says good government to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not so. I was just looking through like the 990 filings and stuff. Like I can't speak with confidence on the connection between like Larsen and Urban Alchemy, but what we can speak on confidence around is that, like Julie mentioned, Larsen contributed $42,000 for two separate legal defense funds to pay for London Breed's fines and attorney fees, after she was fined over $2,000 through city ethics violations because of, nefarious work around pushing Jerry Brown to release her brother from prison, as well as also money being sent to Mohammed Nuru for the car repairs.
Yeah.
So there's a serious amount of overlap, and I think that Mission Local did a great job in breaking down all the different players that were involved in the scandal around Mohammed Nuru, like who's giving money to who and in bed with who, quite literally and figuratively. And so yes, but in terms of like, right, how much directly then like Larsen is turning around and contributing towards these like police extensions, like you're mentioning, like the extension of a law and order that's not explicitly the police department. Yeah, I can't say exactly.
Well, actually, there is one case. He gave a lot of money to SF Safe, which is the public security branch of the SFPD. It used to be a department within the SFPD, and then it's split off, although my belief is that they get more than 90% of their funding from the police. And of course, there's been a recent scandal there where money was being spent extravagantly on retreats and perks for the recently fired executive director. Larsen gave them a pile of money for, again, he wanted them to pilot high-tech surveillance cameras. That apparently none of that work was ever done. And I would have thought a man who prides himself on his investment savvy would have done a better job of looking into SF Safe before he handed them a pile of money for a pet project.
Yeah, and a pile of money at the tune of $1 million. So
Yes, exactly.
yeah,
It-
really
yeah.
significant contribution.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an enormous amount of money. Also, again, this speaks to the mismanagement of our police department, how they could not have known that these crimes were being committed by an organization that's funded, that they give 90% of its funding to is just extraordinary to me.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Let's talk about Kilroy, who is another person that comes to us from the real estate money.
He comes to us from real estate money, and he comes to us from Malibu. He does not live in San Francisco. He is a second generation real estate mogul. His father started the firm, but they have significant holdings in San Francisco, in Orange County, in San Diego. I believe they're also playing in Los Angeles. And I think recently they indicated that they were going to play in Texas as well. Kilroy he seems sort of a basic Republican in the sense that, he votes for lowering taxes. He votes against programs that will cut into his net take home. He doesn't like any kind of social service program. He threw a lot of money to fight against a statewide initiative that would have funded infrastructure for electric cars and for training more firefighters in lieu of the wildfires that happen with great frequency in our state. And the only reason seems to be is that it would have cost him.
Yeah, that greed and an ability to see beyond oneself. I don't know if these people fit all of the characteristics of sociopaths, but that's what I kind of associate this type of person with, people who are so obsessed with defending their own wealth. So the next one on the list is kind of love to hate. One of mine, Garry Tan, who we've talked about on this podcast a couple of times. I've been interested in his connections. He's funded a lot of like the more conservative wing of the Stop Asian Hate movement. So been looking into that a little bit. What else can we tell people about Garry Tan? Where is he putting his money for these upcoming elections?
Garry Tan is a very interesting case to me. I was a business reporter for many years, and I found most business people to be very practically minded, but there is this strain in the high-tech world of people who hold some very peculiar ideological views. Garry Tan seems to like these libertarian authoritarian movements like the network state. He's a disciple of Balaji Srinivasan. He's also a YIMBY, which has some cult-like elements, this notion of if you build it, everyone will be housed.
Yeah.
This very laissez-faire, trickle-down notion of economics that has proven not to work. These are not unintelligent people, so these beliefs actually kind of surprised me. So yeah, and he has been, he's in a very unique position as a guy who has funded a lot of startups, thousands of them, through Y Combinator. He's in a very unique position to organize. So he's been kind of an organizer for the high-tech folks who are interested in getting involved in politics. He seems to like the limelight, so much so that even when he made a mistake, rather than go off into the wilderness for a while and keep a low profile, he went quiet for maybe a week or two and then came back with a vengeance in a New York Times piece.
Right.
Yeah, so I think he's, in a funny way, he's sort of the P.T. Barnum of high tech. Any publicity is good publicity.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Hello again, this is Tofu, editor of the show, here to talk for a bit to tell y'all about how you can support the show. If you have the extra cash, we have a Patreon at patreon.com/SadFrancisco. You can subscribe now starting at $5 a month. On the Patreon, you'll find all of our past episodes, and our Patreon subscribers will have early access to episodes a couple of days before it goes live on our regular platforms. Don't forget to follow us on our TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube channel for additional content and to get updates about the show. And if you're listening on audio platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, go ahead and give us a rating. It really helps us, and it allows the podcast to be recommended to more people on these platforms. That's it for me. Thank you for everyone for the support, and now back to the episode of Sad Francisco.
Yeah, I think of maybe the first time that a lot of people will become aware of Garry Tan was just 2 years ago. I can't believe it's only been a couple of years, but when Silicon Valley Bank was going down, there was a sort of begging Biden, begging the Federal Reserve to come in and save like startups, a bunch of corporate entities that store their money at Silicon Valley Bank, which is now no longer. And although he pitches like this idea of libertarianism and, like you said, like the trickle down and laissez-faire politic, he is really about welfare for corporations, about welfare for rich people. When it's necessary, he will go up on CNBC and beg for forgiveness when it comes to his startup galaxy that he lives in. Like P.T. Barnum, he does like to be in public. He likes to be seen. He likes to take his picture with people like Peter Thiel. He bought a large house that is next to Dolores Park that had been converted into housing. I mean, very luxurious condos, and then not a very good YIMBY. He is just using it for parties, the space that had been converted into housing, and recently had people over for a party, including Peter Thiel.
The Holy Guacamole Party about the intersection of tech.
Oh, yeah.
Within all five of these guys, there's a combination of like people who are just like capitalists and people who are just looking to, capitalist investor types who are looking to increase their bottom line, who then like might have like their own their itch, whatever it is that like gets them going. Amongst them, Tan definitely has struck me in our research as being the most ideologically driven of all five of these guys. He and Moritz both get down with the network state ideology, but like Tan seems to really forefront it and be like a big cheerleader behind it. He's buddy up with Elon Musk. I mean, he's a major player in like the wave of people that came out of Silicon Valley, like in line with Elon Musk and Balaji and Peter Thiel, that like thoroughly believe in like a revolution. They're like, we are creating a revolution. They're creating a different world, and they want to actively, not to put too many words in folks' mouths, but like Elon Musk is a big fan of like colonizing Mars and, go and colonize the moon. Like there's a whole other level of ideologue that's being put into play here. And yeah. I do see Tan as being, one of these like kind of Pied Piper type players to help like build this right-wing coalition that has been so effective at turning the tide in San Francisco elections over the last 4 years.
When I think of people like Tan and Musk, I think of and Thiel, I think of Revenge of the Nerds. These people who are not themselves the most socially adept or trying to create a utopia. I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, part of like the pitch of the network state is centers around this organization, Neighborhood SF, that wants to take part of like basically replace part of central San Francisco, Alamo Square, Hayes Valley, Lower Haight, and gate it off and, have it be a place where like these techno-futurists have a little playground. The rest of us would not be allowed in. Although, certainly I can imagine that it serves them to like exist in cities where there's still going to be, this underclass that can serve them. It's a weird religion that they're pitching.
Yeah, tech. I think Pelagi calls it tech Zionism.
Right. Yeah. Which is wild. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was also, connected in with Peter Thiel's conversation at the Holy Guacamole Party, which is happening on Cinco de Mayo, talking about Christian theology in politics and in tech, and that's been his rap. So it's like there's a whole level of like, talk about like ideologue bit. It's like, yeah, like Balaji kind of sees himself as being this like Abrahamic type of figure within this tech revolution that is going to create an alternative society, a parallel society, I guess is the best way to call it.
That's well put. Yeah.
Wonder how long, in a funny way, I'd love to see them go off and get their East Solano project off the ground. How long
formerly California Forever.
Yeah, I see how long it takes for them to start squabbling with each other. What I've found interesting is when these tech guys make money, the first thing they want to do is set up a compound where they don't have to be around other people. If you're Larry Ellison, that means buying an island, or Mark Zuckerberg too, buying part of an island. But, some of them would content themselves with tearing down ranch houses in the hills above Silicon Valley and then building some impenetrable compound.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the cinematic, like old school kind of movie vision of like, yeah, where does the villain live society in these like old school, like almost like a comic book villain. So I asked Julie this last time around, Jeremy, and wondering if you would do your best to explain to people who haven't been paying that much attention to politics in San Francisco, what is the definition of moderate that you think the media and some local politicians are trying to pitch as it serves people that maybe have ulterior motives when they're talking about local politics in San Francisco?
Yeah, good question. It's a war of words. It's a very clever branding. It's PR in the same way that YIMBY is a great PR branding term. It evokes feeling of like sensical. YIMBY promotes like an affect of like, yeah, like most people agree, like, yes, in my backyard, like that's a good thing. Like build in our backyard, like, create vibrant communities. And when the contrast is NIMBY, which is historically racist and classist people. So it's a great, to call yourself an YIMBY, it's like, yeah, like that's a great term in PR in winning hearts and minds of people just off the bat who don't even have to know anything about it. I would say moderate falls in the same category where it's great PR. It's a lot of people would be happy to see themselves as a moderate, which promotes an affect, I think, of like level-headedness and sense and like, common sense in a way that they would reject being called conservatives, because conservative evokes a different feeling. Conservative evokes that, racists and backwards and ignorant in a lot of ways. And so they say, oh no, I'm not, if they self-branded themselves conservative, people would be like, no, I don't want to deal with that. But they call themselves moderate, and they're like, oh, well, that's a term that I would like to, could see myself being part of, especially someone who's not necessarily politically active or in a political camp. And I think it also helps isolate. And this is part of, the term moderate is also a reactive political tool and a rhetorical tool in reaction to the success of progressives in the country, particularly coming off of the most recent wave of the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd was murdered, among many others. But there is like progressives became so effective. I mean, progressives became very popular vanguard of the Democratic Party. And so to not be a progressive was like a bad thing. It was like, oh, like if you're not a progressive, you're racist. If you're not progressive, you're not with it, and you're not going to win an election. You have to make a statement around defunding the police or like in relationship to the calls that are being pushed forward by the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think helped get a lot of progressives into office in a really amazing way. That being said, so like moderates was like a way to say, okay, like how do we take the win from those progressives and bring it back our way and bring it back towards the conservatives, which on that note, I would say that, in a lot of ways, what I see the agenda of these five big players behind these this dark money network is a like make gentrification great again agenda. It's essentially saying, gentrification, much like the word conservative, much like the word NIMBY, gentrifier or gentrification came to connote something very negative. And the people kind of universally were like, oh yeah, fuck gentrification. We don't want gentrifiers. We don't want like gentrification is a bad thing that causes harm, and we don't want that for our city. Thing is that wealthy people really like gentrification for like a bunch of reasons, and particularly investors, particularly real estate investors. Gentrification is the lifeblood of their industry. And so they had to find a way to, like, in the wake of a lot of losses to progressives, both in office and in referendums, and also like with gentrification as a terminology being so demonized, they had to find a way to like rebrand. And I think that YIMBYism is that rebrand. And I think that, finding a way to say, oh, we're not here to gentrify. We're not gentrifiers. We're not here to, that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is, making the streets safer. What we're doing is cleaning up the streets. What we're doing is addressing the homelessness crisis. That's what we're doing. But really the policies are exactly the same. So I think that's a key part in pulling apart these like rhetorical threads that they'll use that are clever, and they got a lot of money behind their marketing. So they've got their polling down, they've got their PR down, and they're doing what they can to sell what is truly a shitty product.
Yeah. I think that sums it up. I mean, I never underestimate the value of the PR around positive vibes that these movements to enrich just a few people and take the wind out of like these sort of the more progressive gains. I'll call those people out as far left, as extreme, even, if you're talking about things that are popular to most people, like whether it's affordable healthcare or basic human rights for Palestinians, it's like labeling that as, a far left concern seems to go a long way, these people have shown. So that's why it is so important for projects like this to exist, I think, just to point out the inconsistencies. And there are so many in the rhetoric that this kind of more nefarious, this darker side of local political kind of actors, what they represent.
Yeah,
so,
totally. And just to tie a few more threads together here, when you listen to interviews with like Sachin Agarwal or Stephen Buss from Grow SF, they're the co-directors of Grow SF, or listen to Garry Tan talk about how he became politically active. They talk about, I think it's Agarwal, and I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Agarwal who mentions that like his political awakening, is not like Bernie Sanders, or for a lot of people will say, or like, what is it? Like, when Trump was elected or Black Lives Matter or whatever. His political awakening was when Dean Preston and Chesa Boudin were elected. And he was like, oh my God, this city's going in the wrong direction. We need to do something about this. We need to stand up and fight back. And I think that it highlights the fact that like what we're seeing right now is both reactive. It's a reactionary movement coming out of 2020. So it's not just like some big popular wave. It's a direct response as one. Two, the way that they're organizing this is considerably different than his rightward wave is considerably different than we've seen in the past. Because and I've talked about this a good amount just in different places, but like in the past, we had people like Ron Conway, for example, who's like one of the biggest donors to London Breed, besides Michael Bloomberg, talking about out-of-state actors, who's her biggest donor. But Ron Conway, who comes in and says, okay, I'm going to give London Breed a bunch of money. And then that money then turns around and becomes political favors. So when he calls, she answers, stuff like that. What we're seeing right now is the billionaires who are most invested in trying to shape the future of our city have turned around and started these organizations, which is why we call the AstroTurf Network, these fake grassroots organizations, 501c3s, C4s, and PACs, multiple C3s, multiple C4s, multiple PACs, that create a network that they then use as the tool to then recruit candidates to run for office and push forward referendums that they can then pass. So instead of having to then like lobby their politicians that they helped get elected, instead those politicians basically work for them. They're right. Part of their own political machine that they run themselves. And when you look for of these five guys that we mentioned in our report, with the exception of Larsen, who's been pouring like so much money into law and order related races in San Francisco in the last few years. I think he put himself $250,000 into the conservative slate, Democrat for Change slate for the DCCC, which is an insane amount of money for a DCCC election for total, let alone from
Right.
one person. Besides Larsen and Kilroy, he's out of state, but he just cares about his real estate interests. A big major Republican donor. Besides those two, Moritz, Tan, and Oberndorf are all on the boards of Grow SF, Together SF, and Neighbors for a Better San Francisco. So Oberndorf is the president and director of Neighbors for Better San Francisco, which is by far the biggest political group in the city. Great piece on them. Shout out to Mission Local, uncovering the whatever ton gorilla, I think is the title of that piece.
Yeah, we can link to that in show notes for sure.
Cool. Yeah, and that's a great one. Just sort of really putting the spotlight on them. But they're the biggest political spender in San Francisco in the last 5 years. So Oberndorf is the president and director of the board there, really pulling the threads behind the scenes. And they kind of act as the foundation behind Together and Grow. And then, like Julie mentioned, Moritz is on the board. He's helped found Together SF, and he's on the board of Together SF. So he's has his direct play happening through the operations of Together. Kanishka Chang, obviously is CEO, but right, he's one of the board of directors that gives her direction beyond just being a donor. And then Garry Tan is the president of the board of Grow SF. And so he has his direct say, once again, as a donor, but then, and as a person who's able to bring together his people from Y Combinator. And, collectively, the Y Combinator people are half of the donations for the Dumpdine PAC that's raised over almost $250,000, if not more at this point. And that's just the places where we can find reveal donors. But, he's able to continue to directly put influence, not just as a donor, but also then as the president of the board of this nonprofit that then turns around and runs candidates. So it's a much more directly involved approach by these billionaires to create and control the future of the city through these nonprofits than we've seen in San Francisco history. And it's incredibly important, not just for the city, but this same thing, the same AstroTurf organizations taking exerting control is happening in all across the country. I was talking to my first cousin was getting married, talking to her husband. They live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I started talking about AstroTurf organizations, and they were like, "Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. We've got our Mothers for Liberty here in Lincoln." And it's the same thing. They're just a front for the Koch brothers pushing their agenda onto schools, but they show up as community leaders and just concerned citizens or whatever. Yeah. And it's no, this is all bullshit. This is just a bunch of billionaires that are pushing their agenda. So yeah, I think those are just a couple other threads I feel like are important to give some of the context of why I feel like the work that we're doing is so important in revealing the interworkings. Because without it, it's just a bunch of these individuals that are kind of doing their own things.
Right.
And and then to tie them together feels kind of conspiratorial.
But I mean, when people get together in Garry Tan's multi-million-dollar mansion next to Dolores Park, I mean, it's, not just anyone is invited into these parties.
Right. Or the big fundraiser that he had earlier last year to bring together these political forces where he invited Brooke Jenkins to be his main speaker.
Right. The one, there's a good meme of London Breed dancing at that particular party, I believe. I will also post if you need a laugh after this more serious topic. But it gives me a lot of hope that, as you say, it's been fairly easy to get people to come on and want to support this because people aren't as dumb as these billionaires, hope they are in many cases, and that there are a lot of people in San Francisco who are paying attention and want to know more about how this dark money is working its way in and around San Francisco politics. So yeah, thank you.
Totally.
Thank you both.
Totally. No, and they've had to spend so much money to sell such a bad product. They've raised $30 million since over $30 million since 2020, which by comparison is more than every supervisor race in San Francisco from over 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. So they've raised that in the last 4 years, and they spend a lot of money on polling to figure out what sells. And so they're able to then turn around and use tough on crime and like issues around policing as their culture war,
Right.
as the thing that's going to sell. People are much quicker to buy into Law and Order than they are to buy into like tax breaks for the rich. It
Hmm.
polls better. So that's
Hmm.
their issue
Hmm.
that they push forward. But do they actually care about policing? Do they actually care about like safe streets? Like maybe specifically in the communities that they want to be building more condos in and gentrifying, but not for the Bayview unless they want to build another project there for their like elites, or and not for like other neighborhoods that they just kind of like are like that they have less interest in. So
Yeah.
yeah, it becomes just
Yeah.
this culture war issue, and that
Yeah.
they're able to sell and for their own benefit.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, culture war that like materially has like effects on people that are not them. Yeah. I mean, I think it's useful to have also like this kind of info to disseminate, make sure that more people know why we need to make these billionaires and wannabe billionaires as uncomfortable as they want to make the rest of us. And I think this is a great tool to do that because they have Google alerts or whatever like set up on all their names. They're hyper aware of their public profiles and how they're being viewed. Hence, Garry Tan needing to do a quick New York Times profile after he was kind of dragged just weeks before. And yeah, if people want to know more about that, you can go back and listen to our previous episode with Julie. Again, will be linked in the show notes. And last, of course, need to ask, what's the easiest way for people to get their hands on this info?
www.phoenixprojectnow.com and just sign on for the report.
Cool. Thank you so much, Julie, Jeremy. Please come back anytime. Like, hopefully, yeah, looking forward to the next drop. But this one's going to have these people aren't going to run out of money, unfortunately, anytime soon, unless the state comes in and reappropriates some of that wealth. But, that's why, yeah, I think it's so important that these tools exist. Go out and grab a copy. It's free, and we will talk soon.
Yeah,
Great,
thank
you so
you.
much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Yeah, definitely encouraging folks to follow us on social media as well. Phoenix Proj Now, I believe, is our Instagram and Twitter handle. It's like Phoenix PROJ Now, and yeah, we have more stuff coming out soon. I mean, we've been mostly orienting around social media and papers so far, but we have a blog that will be coming out in the not too distant future, hopefully by the end of this month if we get all the pieces together. And looking forward to having a good range of contributors who have been following these issues closely. They'll be able to help put their thoughts into written word to be disseminated and viewed by folks that believe this is an important issue and raise awareness. And definitely for you, Toshio, as well, if you are ever so interested in contributing towards the blog when it drops. Really excited to have contributing members who all have different perspectives, but their eyes on this right wing takeover and the different manifestations of it throughout our city.
Yeah, no, definitely interested. And like Julie and I talked a little bit about this last time, but with the way that journalism and particularly like local journalism has like the industry has tanked. Even just, I think last year was like, if not the worst year on record, the second worst in terms of, job losses among journalists. And a lot of that is happening on a local level. So yeah, new projects like this are really important, especially when we see like, what is it? The Voice of SF. I hesitate to even like mention it. Don't go there. If you do go there, go through archive.org or something. But yeah, I mean, they have some of the money that they're spending now is going into creating, as Michael Moritz, one of the billionaires we just spoke about, created the Standard. And even though they do have they put out pieces that are good from time to time, people should take it with that grain of salt that it is being funded by people with very specific interests. So yeah, glad to hear that there's more media outlets that are going to be covering this stuff.
Totally. Yeah, I learned recently about how Mission Local, how I think Moritz tried to buy Mission Local a few years
Did?
ago.
Oh, wow.
And it didn't go through. Like the owner refused to sell, but he tried.
I had no idea.
And just think about how, like, within how few local media outlets there are currently that have, like, that are able to do good coverage of political issues in the city. But yeah, imagine if we're just talking about the Standard and the Chronicle and no Mission Local with their
Right.
great pieces. So yeah, it's scary. It's scary, the control of information and how, like, social media has become such an outlet for, like, getting info that isn't being covered by mainstream media, and how, like, it shouldn't have to be that way.
Right.
Like, it shouldn't have to be that, like, the best, like, the best on the ground coverage, or like coverage that isn't being directly influenced by a billionaire, is coming just through, like, people reporting because of passion and because they
Right.
know it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I feel that, especially as
Yeah,
like
people like yourself. Yeah.
I have turned to, like, yeah, I mean, 6 months ago, I like didn't really know what a TikTok was really. I know I'm super late to it, but just, again, like some of like I was writing for Vice News at one point. Vice News is completely gone as of January. So
Wow.
recognizing that, yeah, I mean, some of the traditional media outlets, which, a lot of them did have their own problems, but that infrastructure is gone. And so it means that we have to build our own infrastructure, and some of it is already out there, but I'm like super stoked to hear about new projects like this. Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Estolas. If you have it, please throw us a few dollars through patreon.com/sadfrancisco, which will help us pay for podcast hosting, editing, and transcriptions for the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.